we have that great line from Doc Hayward, and he shows us a close-up. And I love this line, which is, "Hell of a way to kill a tick."
One tick, one tick, one tick, one tick.
Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. I find myself in exceptionally good spirits, I must say, because I am so much having fun revisiting the world of Twin Peaks in terms of these episodes, and also the opportunity to be able to speak a little bit about Twin Peaks and these episodes with these video discussions with you, my dear friends. Thank you so much for, once again, thank you for affording me this wonderful opportunity to be able to talk with you and to hear from you about Twin Peaks. And so with that, today I'd like to focus our attention, if I may, on this episode, which is oftentimes regarded as episode 8. And we also understand that we have different seasons, season 1 and season 2. This is also regarded as being the first episode in season 2. But let's just say, just going forward, that to borrow the common naming conventions with regard to the episodes in the context of these seasons, let us consider this episode as being episode 8. So episode 8 is the topic of discussion today. And therefore, as with these previous discussions, I'd like to talk about everything and anything up to and including such episode 8, which is an episode which is from Mark Frost and David Lynch and directed by David Lynch. And it's a kind of a long episode too, so there's a lot packed in there. So I think there's a number of things that we can talk about today. Also, I will not necessarily speak about anything specific beyond this episode. I've seen this series a number of times, as I know maybe a number of you who are watching this video. But just for purposes of the discussions of these videos, I'd like to focus primarily on everything including and everything leading up to and including this episode 8. Finally, as with these discussions and other non-Twin Peaks discussions, just discussions in general on this channel, I am not at all an expert, so I'm going to get a number of the details wrong. But I do say that I have seen this series a number of times, so I am a fan. I consider myself a fan of Twin Peaks, so that's my perspective as I approach this. So with all this being said, let us now continue with this discussion. Now, episode 8. Wow, what an episode. Now, as we know from the previous episode, the season cliffhanger, if you will, from episode 7. So many things happening in terms of the different locations, the hospital, One-Eye Jack's, the hospital, right, Calhoun Hospital, One-Eye Jack's, and the mill and everything like that, and what's happening to people. Things seem to be occurring that are really potentially catastrophic events. Will people live or die? Those sorts of life and death stakes were on the table with all these various cliffhangers that we were watching at the end or up to the culmination of episode 7, which ended with a really shocking cliffhanger of Cooper opening the door of his hotel room and then being confronted by some mysterious figure shooting him. And then to be continued. Well, now it is being continued, and we see Cooper on the floor of his hotel room, 315 of the Great Northern. Notice that there's a considerable amount of distance already between where he's lying on the floor and the door, so one can assume that maybe he was propelled backwards or maybe he staggered backwards, who knows. But anyway, he's lying inert on the floor. There seem to be 2 or 3 bullet wounds, or bullet holes, 2 of which don't seem to be showing any blood, but the third, which is a little bit lower in his abdomen area, seems to be bleeding in maybe the lower right portion of his torso. But he seems to be conscious or alive or something, because there is the sense of life in that. And this is further indicated by the introduction of a character that we have not seen before. This is the character known as the waiter. He's an elderly gentleman who comes in, and he seems to be very much into his job and trying to be sure that the guest in this hotel has all the comforts at such guests' wish and request. Including, there's the phone that needs to be hung up and everything like that. So we have this waiter who seems to be right there on the job, doing what it is that this waiter needs to do in order to fulfill his job duty. So well done, thumbs up, right? So, but then, right, we have also this mysterious figure that also emerges, and around the same time or a little bit afterwards, and with a large height, and also the dark lighting and the mysterious hum and sound on the soundtrack. And so this reminds us, before we get into his comments, where this reminds us of this type of connection or vision or dream of some sort. And actually, there is a really important distinction that's made in this episode later by Major Briggs when he's talking to Bobby and the diner about the distinction between visions and dreams. And what Major Briggs says at that scene is he describes it not as a dream, but as a vision, the vision of him going to his place and describing the ornate detail of the interior and going to the door and seeing Bob, his son, and knowing that everything was okay. And so this is a very powerful moment between father and son. I'll try to get to that later. But this idea of vision and dreams. So we have seen, or we have gotten this notion of dreams and visions. And indeed, when we're talking about David Lynch works, this idea of dream logic oftentimes enters the conversation, I think very reasonably so. But this is a really important distinction, I think, that we can begin to at least consider or interpret in our own way as we individually watch the series and are engaged with its series in our own way. Namely, what is it that we are seeing that might be considered dreams? And what is it that we are considering that might be considered visions? And what is the difference between the two? Maybe in the conversation of Major Briggs, which I think provides a lot of potential insight, or insightful, say, potential interpretation, let me put it that way, which is maybe dreams can be the way in which our subconscious is trying to sift the things that we are thinking. Whereas visions might be considered something from a place beyond us or external to us. So if that's the distinction that can be made, is this what we are seeing now, a vision or a dream? It could be a vision because we seem to be getting some clues or hints from this person of immense height and of giant height. And we see that there are some things that he says here, and he also removes a ring in order to prove in reality that what he is saying is indeed maybe having the semblance of truth. I mean, that's the whole thing too about what this person is trying to say. Not only does he say at this point 3 important clues, right, about there's a man in a smiling bag, the owls are not what they seem, and without chemicals, he points. And then he's trying to convince Cooper that what he's saying is the truth. And then part of that is the removal of the ring that Cooper has on his finger, and removing that as a means of saying, or perhaps proving to Cooper, that this person is maybe not necessarily some part of Cooper's subconscious, but rather maybe a connection from something beyond Cooper, a vision, and maybe a vision that is not so ethereal as one might consider sort of vaporous visions might be, because of the fact that the ring is gone. And Cooper, in fact, acknowledges this. Also, incidentally, we should point out two rings and ring imagery. I've mentioned the idea of donuts. Donuts, there are different shapes of donuts, I get it. Donuts with holes, without holes. But I think the very iconic look of a donut is that of the ring shape. And so the ring-shaped donut we've seen since the first episodes. And now we get a reference to a ring here. We might see some more ring imagery going forward, but let's just keep an eye out for that. But in any event, now we have the ring, we have this large, giant figure, and we have these clues, and then we have the disappearance. So this also reminds us, too, about the dream that Cooper had earlier with some episodes ago with the red curtained room and Laura Palmer. There are some figures that seem to be Laura Palmer. There's another figure there, a mystery man. of sorts. Again, we'll talk about the reference to Mystery Man that Laura made in the Dr. Jacoby tapes in a moment. But yes, so that also brings up the question, is that a dream or is that a vision? There was also this idea that was, recall about Cooper and Tibet and his connections with Tibet and the dreams that he had. Are those dreams, when he speaks of dreams, are they dreams that are within him, or is there something connecting to him via this dream, quote unquote, dream landscape? And that thing that is connected to him is something beyond him. We shall see, we shall see. But in any event, there's a lot going on here, and it is also connected to the investigation. And also, it brings us to more talk with Diane, and we get some philosophy about Cooper, about his perspective on death. It's a type of maybe transcendental philosophy about death and the outlook on death, and sort of almost a type of freeing from the pain of the physical being, which is a very philosophical concept, I think. And he's expressing this at the time or the point where maybe he perceives himself to be at the point of dying. But we know that he doesn't die, at least in the semblance of what we see as viewers of this series, because a little bit later we see him emerge and we see him in the hospital. He and another, practically everyone in Twin Peaks seems to be at this hospital. But in any event, yes, we have him regaining consciousness several hours later, and Lucy and Sheriff Truman and Doc Hayward is there. And so we understand, we get a little bit of what happened. When he was answering the door, he was lifting up his bulletproof vest. And then a little bit later when he's talking to Albert, and Albert returns as well, so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But he says that he was trying to remove what we understand now is a wood tick. And how do we know that is a wood tick here? It's a tick. We have that great line from Doc Hayward, and he shows us a close-up. And I love this line, which is, hell of a way to kill a tick, right? So when I was young, I used to live in Connecticut. And we lived in an area that had a lot of woodland area near our house or surrounding our house. And we had a dog, a terrier named Maggie, and we'd walk around. It was a lovely place, really beautiful. I loved living there. It was one of the most cherished memories of my life. One of the things, though, about living there was that there were ticks in the woodland area, and so we always have to be careful. We'd have to take care to be sure that our dogs were fully protected, or if there was some kind of tick infestation, we'd have to be sure to go to the veterinarian, etc. But yes, I can totally understand this idea of ticks and the bleeding and the like, and so there's a lot of that imagery. So this idea of the ticks and the bleeding and the bullets. So, but I've never considered this method of tick extermination that seems to be presented here by Doc Hayward and company. So very interesting way to kill ticks in the world of Twin Peaks. Now, going forward, we also have, as I mentioned, so many people here and also I should mention too that Cooper in the hospital, this idea of Cooper recuperating in the hospital, we may or may not see something similar like that going forward, but let's just keep this in mind. It seems to be imagery that is floating into the night in a manner of speaking. Now, as I mentioned, there are so many other people in the hospital. Let's try to get to as many of these people as possible, right? So first we have Norma. I'm sorry. Norma. Yes, we have Norma and Shelley, because Norma is visiting Shelley, who's in the hospital. Shelley survives, right, after being tied up in the mill from the previous episode by Leo Johnson. We also understand Leo Johnson has survived too, but he's in a coma. We also understand that Pete has survived. So Shelley and Pete have regained consciousness. And in particular, I'm not sure to what extent Shelley is able to digest and eat the food at the hospital. Pete has a very violent reaction against the hospital food. Norma also makes a reference when she's visiting Shelley in the hospital, that the hospital food might cause diseases in and of itself. We also see a doctor later about, talking to a nurse about reporting about the food. It's really intolerable. There's a lot of food references. When Bobby visits Shelley, he also makes reference, or he looks at the food, and it's this kind of gooey green stuff. There's a movie called The Green Slime. And so I don't necessarily think of the green slime necessarily, but now that I think about the gooiness of the hospital food, I think, there might be some green slime reference, maybe inadvertent or unintentional. But in any event, it does look like green slime. But what was I saying? So yes, so there's Norma visiting Shelley, but of course Norma also sees Ed and Nadine, because we understand Nadine is also unconscious because of her attempt on her life and the overdose of sleeping pills. And she's there in the room, and Norma sees how distraught and upset Ed is, and just looking over her. And also we see and we get more information about the relationship between Ed and Nadine, and therefore the relationship between Ed and Norma, when a little bit later Sheriff Truman and Cooper and indeed Albert, they go to the hospital, and they see Dr. Jacoby as well, but they also have the moment to talk with Ed. And what do they talk about? Ed is distraught, of course, and this gives the opportunity to allow Cooper, and thus allow us, to know a little bit more about the situation between Ed and Nadine, and how Ed, at one time when they were very young, thought that Norma, and Ed and Norma were going out, but he thought that Norma was cheating on him with Hank, and so he was very upset and distraught and distressed at the time. But then Nadine was there with him, to the point where they got married, kind of on a spur of the moment impulse type of thing. Well, later, when all the dust settled, according to what Ed says to us, he realized, or he understood, that nothing had happened in terms of any kind of sexual relations between Hank and Norma. But he had now, by that time, after that realization, now was married to Nadine. So he tried to think about a way to maybe get a divorce or annulment or something. But there was something about how Nadine was so happy to be with Ed. And also Ed talks about the situation involving Nadine's eye, and how Ed admits that he is the one responsible for the incident that caused Nadine to have an accident with regard to her eye. Now she has the eye patch. This brings up a very fascinating detail in Twin Peaks, is when we hear the story about the honeymoon, and how Ed shooting the gun off, and the ricochet causing, hitting Nadine, of course by accident, of course, but the damage was done. And Cooper is very much sympathetic, and so is Sheriff Truman when he's standing there. But Albert is also standing there, and we see the shot of Albert laughing. This is a very typical Albert moment, and while on the one hand I do, of course, I think Ed's character is really wonderful, great, and I also love the Nadine character, and I love that dynamic, actually, and especially since the previous episodes, when we realize just the depth of the sorrow of Ed and how much feeling and emotion he has towards Nadine. It's really quite lovely. Ed's one of my favorite characters, don't get me wrong, but this moment about Albert and that little shot of him laughing, I find that to be so funny. I find that to be so outrageously funny. And it goes to this thing about Twin Peaks, which is another fascinating thing. It reminds me about the funeral of Laura Palmer, with Leland going up and down there, and then a little bit later we see Shelley just making fun of that with some guests, with some customers at the diner. And so that to me is really the way in which different perspectives can occur, seemingly opposite takes can occur on a singular event. It can be tragic to some, but really funny to others. And so that is a really a fascinating thing. It's also a revelation, I think, of the character of Albert and Cooper, although I think there might be room, because we see the return of Albert here, and there's still that antagonism between Albert and Sheriff Truman and Andy. Although we also see that Cooper seems to be more siding with the Twin Peaks community than he is with Andy. Remember when Albert first arrived, Cooper was giving everyone the thumbs up about Albert, but slowly but surely he seems to be siding with the people of Twin Peaks. And so, and we got that in terms of how he handled Albert during one of the season 1 episodes, when he was talking with Gordon Cole over the intercom. That when now he's back. But there still is a little bit of antagonism between Cooper and Albert, although they are work colleagues, and we still understand how brilliant Albert is, because he, as a forensics expert, in terms of being able to identify all the details about his assailant, Cooper's assailant, when he was shot, etc., and getting more information there. And then, of course, Albert is assisting with the investigation into, the death and murder of Laura Palmer, and also how it might be related to Teresa Banks as well. And we get more information about Teresa Banks, Laura Palmer, and also Ronette in this episode as well. So there's so much going on here. So Albert does have a role. in the investigation. He also has a role, I think, in terms of the emotional character arcs. There's an antagonistic relationship, but maybe might be some room there for some interesting development. We shall see, my dear friends. We shall see. But in any event, going back to the hospital matters, Calhoun, right? So that's that's Ed and Nadine. I mentioned Norma as she was visiting Shelley, and Shelley's in the hospital there. So I should mention too that great moment where Norma talks to Shelley because Shelley says she has a sweet tooth. And so Norma says, I'll bring you some pie. And she mentions chocolate peanut butter pie. Norma does. Chocolate peanut butter pie. Now, I don't know about you, but I have never in my life been so fortunate to have been able to have tasted a chocolate peanut butter pie. I've had Reese's peanut butter cups, and I love Reese's peanut butter cups. I really love Reese's peanut butter cups, but I've never had a chocolate peanut butter pie. What I would give for the chance to have a slice of chocolate peanut butter pie, my goodness, the thought of it just makes it melts my brain. But anyway, and he says, I think, bring the whole pie. Well, yes, bring two, right? I don't know. But speaking of Shelley, when she's in the hospital a little bit earlier in the episode, we see her being visited by Bobby. Now, this interaction between Bobby and Shelley, I think, is really significant in the context of their relationship for a number of reasons. First, Bobby is openly visiting Shelley, and he's openly expressing his affection and worry about her. And she says, aren't you worried that people will see you? And he doesn't care. He says he doesn't care. So this is almost in a way a type of acknowledgement. The first time they're acknowledging out in the open. I know there's no one else in the room, at least we don't see, but it's kind of out in the open of their relationship, at least from Bobby's perspective, because up to now it's been hidden. Remember at the very start, the pilot, they pretend that they're not going together, that they're not a couple when they leave the diner together, but then when they're in the car, they are kissing and they wonder if Norma suspects, etc. But now that we now are to another stage of the relationship. So this is, I think, a really significant part of that this scene. Also, they express to each other, I love you. And he says, yes, I guess I love you too. So that is also really important too. Now, remember, I have, Bobby is a very complex character, but I have expressed in these video discussions in the past about how much I find Bobby's character development to be really such an interesting thing. I mean, so many interesting things about Twin Peaks, one of them being the character development of Bobby. And we see that a little bit here, how much he is really devoted and in love with Shelley. We shall see how that relationship develops over time, of course, another fascinating aspect. So also I mentioned too that really great scene in the diner between Major Briggs and Bobby, father and son. Bobby, they seem to be so separate, totally on different planes. And indeed, when we've seen them together in previous episodes, for example, where the family is meeting Dr. Jacoby in a previous episode, there is no connection between them. Nothing. And they were right in the funeral and the lighter with Bobby and just screaming and shouting. So total disconnect between father and son. But here, when there are two of them together, Bobby, of course, at first has a very standoffish type of attitude, but he agrees to sit down after being invited by his father. And he asks, what do you do? It's classified. So we don't have any information directly about Major Briggs's job, but there is a sort of sensitivity that we see associated with it, or at least how he describes his job. But then he goes into the vision. Now, I mentioned before that here, this is where Major Briggs talks about the distinction between visions and dreams, which I think is a really significant piece of dialogue. And we'll keep that, and I try to mention a little bit why earlier in this discussion, but let's keep that in mind, or I'll try to keep that in mind as I watch the series again going forward. And then he talks about his vision and the connection that he makes with Bobby and Bobby's reaction to it. This is really important. Now, one of the wonderful things about a Lynch work is how he creates magic out of seemingly thin air, out of seemingly nothing. You notice in a Lynch work, for instance, you can start out with something that seems a shot or a scene that can seem to be very innocent or non-threatening or completely just an ordinary mundane thing. We've seen this in many, many shots throughout Lynch's filmography. Inland Empire, Straight Story, Mulholland Drive, Blue Velvet, right? things that start out seemingly ordinary, wild at heart, and then suddenly they emerge and something happens and suddenly it becomes scary. Or something becomes frightening. A different type of emotion is also possible, namely, something can occur out of nothing, out of thin air, and it becomes totally beautiful and magical at the same time. This is one of those moments. Here we have a seemingly mundane scene between father and son, total disconnect between the two, as we've intuited from previous encounters between the characters in past episodes. Again, sitting at a diner table, right, talking, nothing, but then suddenly it evolves, and then just seemingly out of nowhere, it turns into this most beautiful moment. Now, this is the stuff of David Lynch that I love. Things that create magic out of. Oh, it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So that's an example of the David Lynch magic going forward. All right, so sorry about that. Now I had to step out, but now I'm back. So continuing on with the conversation. So where were we? So there are some other characters that we have to speak about with regard to this great episode, episode 8. So, for example, I mentioned Norma a little bit in passing when we're talking about Shelley. And actually, before we leave the discussion about Shelley, let me also mention that Leo Johnson, we understand, has survived being shot. And the implication from episode 7 is that he was shot by Hank through the window. Now, we don't know that the characters in the world of Twin Peaks know about this, although we were speaking about Bobby earlier. Bobby seems to get a sense, or he seems to understand that, yes, when he was there at Leo Johnson's house and he was about to get axed, that it was indeed Hank who was outside and who killed, or not killed, but who shot Leo Johnson. And so we get that little flashback in the diner with Bobby after Bobby has that great talk with his father. So the implication perhaps is that Bobby knows or suspects that maybe it was Hank who did it. But how did he know? Was he able to look out of the window? I'm not sure. I don't remember him looking out of the window at the time at that scene in episode 7. Maybe he did and I just didn't catch it. But in any event, there's a lot of that stuff that goes on in terms of how the flashbacks are used. It's a very interesting way of, I wouldn't call it necessarily retrofitting, but it's a very interesting way of how flashbacks and dream imagery are intertwined. When we get to Dr. Jacoby in that discussion here in a subsequent episode, I think we'll find that employed in earnest. But it's done in a very effective way, and it's also done in order to further the plot, because also Twin Peaks, is many things, and one of the things is as a drama, as a soap opera drama. So very important stuff indeed. Now, going forward also, we have the, let's see, oh yes, when we're talking too about what happened with Leo Johnson and the recreation of what happened in the house, we have Sheriff Truman and Harry Truman and Dale Cooper, and then the investigation going on because of the idea that something was forgotten, or there was a clue somewhere in Leo Johnson's house. That's the implication of the vision or dream / vision from Cooper, and so they're able to go in there. They don't need a warrant because again, it's Leo Johnson was found shot. So they're investigating the place, and they do find some evidence which implicates possibly that Leo Johnson had something to do with the burning down of the mill. That's thanks to the great detective work of Hawk. And then also we understand that Officer Andy was the one who found Leo Johnson, according to what Lucy says at the hospital. And then also they recreate what happens, Dale Cooper and Sheriff Truman does. And here they're talking about how the TV was moved from its position based on the imprints in the carpet and the like. And so Dale Cooper puts together the pieces that maybe he was about to attack someone and then he got shot through the window. And Sheriff Truman all the way mentions Shelley Johnson. Was it Shelley? So Dale Cooper said, keep your mind off of Shelley for 1 minute. So although I must admit that, Shelley Johnson, I don't know if this is truly indicative of the fact that maybe Sheriff Truman is in that way enamored by Shelley Johnson. He's just mentioning Shelley Johnson's name a lot, I think. We also know that Sheriff Truman's heart is with Josie. And we'll explain a little bit later what happens in the Josie, Pete, Catherine storyline when he goes and talks to Pete later in the episode. But Needless to say, just as an aside, I can very honestly say that I too am in the Shelley Johnson fan club. If I'm very proud to be a member of that fan club, but not just Shelley Johnson. I'm a fan club. I'm a fan club member of many of the characters here in Twin Peaks, but Shelley Johnson is one. In any event, going forward, yes, the investigation is ongoing. And before we go into more points of the investigation, we also have to mention, I mentioned a little bit, Norma. And Norma and the pies and Hank. And Hank, again, is showing his hand in many ways. He's both trying to be on the up and up, as a manner of speaking, trying to show his sort of good side, his good-natured side, working at the diner, asking about the pie. How was the pie according to Major Briggs? It was a delicious pie, exceptional. And there's more wonderful, eloquent observations and exclamations about the pie. But also, Hank shows his connections to the underbelly of Twin Peaks, and this is, for instance, in the way in which he is conversing with Ben and Jerry Horne. After all, it was the idea about what happened to Catherine, what happened to the mill, what happened to Leo Johnson. So Hank was supposed to take care of all of this, and so they question about what happened to Catherine. They question about what happened. Why isn't Leo dead? So what happened? So there is that connection with the underworld, or not the underworld, but the underbelly, the undercurrent, the underbelly of Twin Peaks, as represented here in this episode, among other things, by Ben and Jerry Horne, and specifically perhaps Ben Horne. Now, Ben Horne is showing to be very, very complex and very much, he is very much of someone who is a two-timing almost villain, in a manner of speaking, although there might be room for looking at him from a sort of humorous way and a way that might lead room to some character growth and development in terms of that department. Of course, we shall see. I think we get hints of that. We've gotten hints of this already throughout the series so far, but in particular with his relationship, his ongoing relationship with Jerry, and they're talking about food, and there's a moment when they're coming out of the elevator or somewhere, and they talk just in mid-conversation about the food and dipping the head in the sauce and all this, and French food or something. It's really quite remarkable. And then amongst this, they say, "Oh, have you seen Audrey?" "Oh, no, I haven't seen Audrey." So that's in that conversation. The bit about Audrey is the aside, and the thing about the food and the delicacy, that's the main part of the conversation. Although in the context of Twin Peaks, we know that the opposite's true. In fact, in a manner of speaking, the thing about Audrey is probably the key point, the critical point about it. Incidentally, too, before this, we get the call from this mysterious man in a suit. And he seems to be of Asian descent, and he is calling for Josie Packard, but Josie's not there, and so we had seen another gentleman who was shot, or who was depicted in a slightly, maybe not necessarily mysterious way, but yeah, maybe mysterious way, when Audrey is walking down the corridor after she leaves behind the note in one of the earlier episodes. It's not quite the same gentleman, I think, because this gentleman has like a pony. I'm not sure about the one in the earlier episode. I think they're different. But in any event, yes, there is this element that's going on that seems to be introduced slightly. And it seems to be, from here, we're getting a sense that maybe, and then he says later after he gets off the phone, he calls for Hong Kong. So there seems to be some kind of connection with Hong Kong. And maybe there's something to do with people trying to find Josie. Who knows? I'm not sure what this is going on, or maybe I do, and I'm just pretending not to know, because maybe I think. Well, actually, let me just say that it might come up later in the series. Okay. But speaking of Josie, we also understand. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we go to Josie, I forgot to say one thing too about Ben and Jerry. So this relationship between the two of them, I think, gives room for the possibility that we might see some interesting character growth in the form of something non-villainous in the context of Ben Horne. After all, though, we've seen, I think, the real kind of disgusting, or potentially disgusting route that he went, especially at the end of the last episode, into this episode, because right after all, he could have, I mean, he went into One-Eye Jack's thinking that there was a new girl, but in fact, lo and behold, he didn't know it, but it was actually Audrey, his daughter. So She hid herself, or she put the mask on, and she was trying to push away his advances. And thank goodness for Jerry's intervention, because he had to pull him away for some other errand of some sort, or some other matter that required his attention, etc. But that is a very low point for one's, say, sympathies for Ben Horne. It might be said that he didn't know that Audrey was there. It was, in fact, his daughter Audrey. He didn't know. But needless to say, that it's a very disturbing situation that is presented in that particular moment. Thank goodness things did not cross a certain line where they very could have. And it could have gotten, it was already quite disturbing to begin with, but it could have got even more disturbing. But it didn't quite go there. That being said, yes, it does present the situation of Ben Horne in a somewhat unsympathetic light. Now, let's see if this unsympathetic light can change over time or not. We shall see. We shall see. Incidentally, too, we should also keep in mind that Audrey is now seemingly being kept here at One Eye Jack's against her will. So this is showing a slightly villainous aspect of Blackie. So there's Blackie and the guy that Audrey refers to as the refrigerator. So there is this element here. So now Audrey is in danger, and she's being held captive. And there's a moment where she's hoping that Dale Cooper will listen to the message, or to read the message, and come to her rescue. And that connection, that wonderful connection. Unfortunately, it seems like Dale Cooper is not getting the message yet. So he's not aware of what the situation Audrey's in. However, we are aware. So let's keep an eye as to how and if and how this develops over time. This also, again, it puts Blackie in a somewhat villainous light, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. But at the same time, we also understand there is a tension or stress as between Blackie and Ben and Jerry Horne, in terms of some kind of dynamics of power, or lack thereof, as she might perceive it, with regard to herself in the context of that relationship. Okay. Now, oh gosh, so much to say. So much. Now, speaking of Josie, and we have to mention too that she appears to be gone. Catherine is not here. So the idea is, when Sheriff Truman visits Pete, who is out of the hospital after this suffering smoke inhalation, it's like having his lips stuck to the tailpipe of a car or something. They're talking about Josie. Josie seems to have gone off. Maybe she's just gone off shopping or something. That could be possible, at least according to Pete. So it's not quite up to a kind of emergency level yet. Although, of course, Sheriff Truman is visibly concerned. But also, this turns into a conversation about Catherine. She might not have survived the mill fire. So in any event, this is another time where we see Pete really show some genuine affection and emotion for Catherine. We saw a hint of it, or not a hint, we saw quite a healthy dose of it, in fact, in the previous episode, when the two of them have a type of rapprochement, as we were talking about with the episode 7. And so now we see that continuation. I don't think it's an act. I think Pete is being very genuine here about his feelings towards Catherine. So it's a very touching moment again. I mentioned I'm in the Shelley Johnson fan club. I'm in the Sheriff Truman fan club. I'm in the Pete Martell fan club. I'm in the Dale Cooper fan club. So I'm in a lot of fan clubs when it comes to Twin Peaks. And I'm in the Audrey Horne fan club. I'm in the Donna Hayward fan club. When we talk about the James fan club, James Hurley fan club, let's wait a little bit. Let's wait a couple episodes when we talk a little bit more about James, because there's going to be... My lips are sealed. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I said I wouldn't get ahead of myself. But anyway, speaking of James, though, let's talk about James here. So James has been arrested. He spent the night in jail because of the drugs that were found in his bike. Of course, we know from the previous episodes that this was planted by Bobby, who seems to like planting evidence on people that he doesn't like. We saw that a little bit with Leo and that thing with Jacques Renault. But... Also, yes, James is now being interrogated by Sheriff Truman a little bit, and we get something very interesting about some of the final or some of the moments, some of the things that Laura said to him before she died. Fire, playing with fire, and mentioning this person, playing with someone named Bob. So this is also a kind of mysterious thing. Bob is being mentioned. So we know that there is a character named Bobby. We know Bobby and Mike, right? In particular, Bobby. Bobby appears early in the episode, of course, or elsewhere in the episode. We also have to remember that there was some figure in a previous episode that was referred to as Bob. And there's reference to Bob Lydecker, but there's also reference perhaps to another figure with long silver hair. And we saw a little bit of the glimpse of this in the dream sequence, or the quote unquote dream sequence, vision sequence that Cooper had several episodes ago. Speaking of which, we also see Mr. Gerard, Philip Gerard, right, with his suitcase filled with, we assume, shoes, enter into the sheriff's department here. So very interesting developments here, especially when we recall to this dream sequence from Cooper and the like. So this mentioning of Bob is very curious by James, and how this was part of the, some of the last things that he remembers Laura telling him. And some things, she said a lot of weird things. He says some things just went by him, but other things didn't. He would remember this was one of those things. So this may or may not be significant. Who knows? But in any event, there's that element. So, and then speaking of James, I mentioned also Donna. Donna has some kind of turn here. It's very fascinating. She gets the sunglasses. She talks a little bit with Madeline. And then she's beginning to show a lot of smoking habits here. There's a bit of a type of display of a type of sexiness on her part, that an outward show of a type of sexy nature to her that is totally on display when she visits James in the cell there, and she's licking his finger or biting his finger and sharing an embrace through the bars. It's quite a sort of almost a very intense scene in terms of heated passions. Maybe the passions are very, very heated on her side of the bars versus his side of the bars. Who knows? But in any event, yes, this is an indication possibly some kind of transformation may be going on in the part of Donna. Maybe this is another effect of the absence of Laura going on here. And maybe this is a means by which she is beginning to try to assume the position of Laura Palmer, because we're beginning to understand that Laura Palmer seems to have had a lot of, or potentially some degree of maybe sexual experience, let's put it that way. And maybe this is Donna's way of trying to interpret that in her mind, or maybe it could be some kind of a result of external influence. Who knows? Who knows? But in any event, there is a type of market change that's going on here. It's a very interesting, fascinating one. And then also we have to understand too that the relationship between Donna and Madeline is still ongoing. Madeline is also changing her appearance somewhat. The removal of the glasses, almost the graduation, in a manner of speaking, of the glasses. Although I did mention in an earlier discussion, I thought those glasses look really cool. And then they're talking about what happened to Dr. Jacoby and the like. Now, when I speak of Madeline, I should mention too, there is a very important scene in the Palmer house, and we get an outside shot of the Palmer house. We've gotten a lot of exterior shots of the Palmer house. Let's see how consistent this is. Let me just put it that way. Is it going to be the same house going forward, or are there going to be changes to the house when we see other exterior shots in future episodes? But in any event, we have the exterior, which brings us to the Palmer household. Era somewhat still in around the first half of this episode, and we see in the living room Madeline and Sarah Palmer talking, and then they're sitting down on their couches or sofas respectively. Madeline is looking down at the carpet, and she says that she had a dream about this particular carpet, and then Sarah, was Laura in the dream? And before Madeline could answer, we see Leland emerge from behind a screen with singing and these sort of tunes, and then his hair is all white, and people are like, what's going on? Wow, what's going on here? And so we have that further development. Of course, we understand and recall that what Leland did at the end of episode 7 was a very shocking event, and we also understand from this episode that indeed Jacques Renault died. Jacques Renault died. So the implication is, at least without further information, it can be assumed that indeed it was Leland Palmer who killed Jacques Renault in that act of smothering with the pillow. Everyone says he was suffocated. So this is a kind of really terrible thing that we see Leland do. But in any event, I'm not sure what this means, or maybe I do, but I'm just saying I don't because I don't want to talk about further episodes until we get to them. But in any event, yes, Leland's hair is white and he's singing these tunes, and people are like, "What's going on? Wow!" Of course, if I wake up the next morning and I see someone I know and the person's hair is all white, I'm gonna take notice. Something's not quite right here. And then that the scene, of course, doesn't end there because then we get a shot of the carpet and a stain that seems to go into the carpet and then disappear. And then Madeline really is upset by it. She's crying, and there's a close up on her. Oh my gosh, she's crying. So I should take a moment here and say that there are the great Blu-ray releases of Twin Peaks, the many box sets, the many sets, DVD sets, box sets, etc. And so I'm sure for a lot of people, you have the Blu-ray set, or you're able to watch it through any kind of recent release version. That's great. When you get to the scene, you'll see the stain go across the carpet there, and Madeline react accordingly. However, for those of you who know maybe how it was broadcast, or maybe if you have earlier releases, such as say like I've got here on the side here, this is a box which has all the VHS tapes of Twin Peaks, the first 2 seasons. Also, this is kind of heavy, but you can also get the Twin Peaks seasons in this great Laserdisc set, which is from Japan. Both of these are in Japan, by the way. So I have the VHS and the Laserdisc. And so these older releases have this particular scene. But the scene actually has superimposed on that carpet thing. You see like these squiggly images of this silver-haired person that we saw in Cooper's dream, and that we actually will see a little bit at the very end of this episode. So it's an interesting change as to what happens. So that is removed, I think, from earlier versions, and now we get the carpet stain across. For this Blu-ray, at least the Blu-rays I have. So, but anyway, what was I saying? So yes, I should point out too that here, this is very significant as well. We're speaking a little bit about dreams and visions. We see some visions, or we hear about some visions. Cooper and the tall guy, and the giant, as we might call, and the vision of Major Briggs. Here we see Madeline, or we hear Madeline describe this moment as she saw this in a dream about the carpet. And this also brings us to Dr. Jacoby. Dr. Jacoby, when he is questioned in the hospital bed by Cooper and by Sheriff Truman, he talks about a number of things. He talks here about the locket, about how it was he who took the locket out from the ground after he saw Donna and James bury it there. And he also recognizes that the half-heart locket is like a symbol or metaphor for Laura as well, the half-heart, double sides, and the like. And it also shows that he has a kind of genuine emotional connection towards Laura. I should point out that, Dr. Jacoby, it's not quite clear exactly what his real motivations are vis-a-vis his relationship with Laura Palmer. Whether he might have had maybe a kind of physical or sexual attraction to her, we're not quite sure. Or we could probably infer one thing or the other, depending on our interpretation, of course. Especially also when we hear some of the taped dialogue, the "What's Up, Doc" tapes that we hear, and about how Laura uses the word naked or something like that. Although this could also be just Laura's way of trying to tease Dr. Jacoby. Because according to Dr. Jacoby and James and others, Laura seemed to have also known of the effect that she had on men in general. And so that might have been the way in which she was trying to talk with Dr. Jacoby. But again, we're not quite sure of Dr. Jacoby's feelings. However, we can in one way sense a genuine affection and a genuine care, and how he interprets, and he can understand that maybe Laura wanted to, or she allowed herself to die, which, when questioned by Cooper, he's not suggesting that this is suicidal, but rather she allowed herself to die. Now that, I think, has a very strong significance, and I'm very I'm intrigued that, in fact, the script or the story took the point to took the time to make the point that Dale is saying, she didn't commit suicide, and Dr. Jacoby says, that's not what I'm saying. I don't think it's not suicide, but it's a matter of letting herself be killed, which might be slightly different or quite different depending on the circumstances. There's also the other part of the Jacoby discussion, which is what happened in the intensive care unit or the intensive care ward because of what happened to Jacques Renault. And so at this point, there isn't much discussion about it, although we understand that they were in the same ward or the same unit or the same part of the room or whatever. And so Dr. Jacoby's a potential witness as to what happened to Jacques Renault. So he doesn't go into too much detail here, but he does say a couple things that are very significant, I would say. At least a couple things, maybe more. But the two things I want to bring up here are, first, he says, it's like a dream. This is like a dream. So this is also very significant. So we've already had mentions of dreams or visions in a number of places, with Cooper, with Major Briggs, and with Madeline, and now with Dr. Jacoby. So this idea of a dream, being in a dream, or it's like a dream, this seems to be very significant in the context and world of Twin Peaks. We've seen a number of dream/vision references made up to now. Who knows, we may or may not see similar or quite direct relevant references like that going forward. We shall see. We shall see. But this is one important aspect here. The second important aspect is he mentions the smell. There's some kind of smell. Now, he describes the smell in one way, but before he's able to describe the smell, Cooper takes it upon himself to make the line, which is a very, very, very intriguing line. He says, and I'm paraphrasing. He says, "It's usual in cases of strangulation for the victim to void his bowels." And you can see after that moment, and he says it in such a monotone way, very serious way, deadly serious. I love the bit which cuts right to Dr. Jacoby. And you see an eye roll, like, oh my gosh, what did I just hear? And it cuts to Sheriff Truman. He's sitting there, and you see, how you when you're like, you're so perplexed as to what's happened that your brow moves, and to the point, like when your brow moves, the whole like skull, like cap of your skull, like your hairline, like moves, like that. It's like that's what happened to Sheriff Truman right now after he heard that thing about people voiding their bowels. And so it's just that's that. I love that like movement of the hair. You watch that moment again and see how much his hair moves, Sheriff Truman's hair. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. What a line that is, right? It's usually in case of strangulation for the victim to void his bowels. Wow. I'm not a forensic expert, and I don't investigate murder, so I don't know this stuff directly. But I mean, if Cooper says it, then I'm likely to believe it more than not. So in any event, but that's not the smell that Dr. Jacoby's referring to. He refers to it as a kind of oil smell, or scorched oil, some burnt or scorched oil smell. Very interesting. We shall see if, how, maybe not, this might be significant. But anyway, scorched oil, that smell, this odor that was in the air. And he also heard the fire alarm. So this all seems to correspond around the time that Jacques Renault was killed by Leland at the hospital, so Calhoun. So in any event, let's keep an eye out for, or a nose out for that, if and when that might be significant. But that's Dr. Jacoby, is it not? So yes, what else can we say about this that hasn't already been said? I guess we can maybe further out the details. I mentioned Andy and his discovery of the drugs that are hidden in the plank of wood that he steps on and it hits him in the face. When his nose wasn't broken, but just only blood squirted out or something. And as he says, and also speaking of Leo Johnson, there are some other details that are emerging. Hungry Horse, Montana, how Leo Johnson was incarcerated, according to what Andy was able to find. He was incarcerated around the time, which is February 9th, I think, 1988. I hope I got that date right. February 9th, 1988, which is, according to Dale, Cooper, and Albert, this is the time in which Teresa Banks was killed. And so if Leo Johnson was at Hungry Horse at the time, this means that Leo Johnson has an alibi for the killing of Teresa Banks. Now, remember, we heard this name Teresa Banks mentioned all the way back into the pilot of this. So this was a crime that happened. Maybe, according to Dale Cooper, maybe a similar crime that happened. We understand with the idea of the letters under the fingernail. Here for Teresa Banks and Laura Palmer, the T and the R respectively. It's quite a grisly detail. But this means that whoever killed Teresa Banks was probably the same perpetrator who killed Laura Palmer and nearly killed Ronette Lasky. So in any event, yes, if Leo is being suspected for the killing of Laura Palmer, then the idea was that maybe he also had something to do with Teresa Banks. But if he has an alibi for the killing of Teresa Banks, then what does that mean in terms of the possibility of him killing Laura Palmer? It doesn't rule him out entirely, of course, but it's just part of the investigation aspect of this. Speaking of the investigation aspect of this, I must say too that there's a very classic shot in this, in about the middle of the episode, of where everyone is assembled in the sheriff's station in the meeting room, and there are the donuts, and we have the shot and the overlapping of the woods and everything that's going on as we get a breakdown of what Albert and Cooper know so far about how Laura left James Hurley at Sparkwood at 21 around 12:30, and then she went into the woods where she met up with Jacques Renault and Leo Johnson and Ronette Plasky, and they went to the cabin, passing by the Margaret's cabin, the log lady's cabin, because we understand from the Into the Night episode, from some episodes back, that those cabins are nearby. So Jacques' cabin and then Margaret's cabin. And that's probably where maybe, I mean, I don't want to say too much about the log, but remember when we met the log, what the log said, and how Margaret interpreted what the log said for us. In any event, yes, so we understand that Jacques Renault, the four of them, they went to the cabin around 1 or so. There, that we understand that Laura Palmer had sexual relations with both Leo and Jacques, and she was tied up. That Waldo was let loose, and Waldo bit on Laura Palmer. It's a very grisly detail that there was some kind of altercation between Leo and Jacques Renault. This explains the thing that Jacques Renault mentioned some episodes back about being hit with the bottle by Leo and the bleeding, and using the shirt to stop the bleeding. And then when when Jacques Renault was out, Leo Johnson and the two girls went out, and he took the two girls somewhere. However, not to the train car, because what Albert and Dale Cooper surmise here is that Leo Johnson then left the two of them, stranded in the woods, for a third man, a third person. He's referred to as a third man, the third man, to come in and take the girls to the train car. And it's the idea of Albert and Cooper that it was this third man who then took the girls to the train car and who ended up knocking Ronette unconscious. They were both tied up. Ronette for the first time, Laura for the second time, because Laura had been tied up in the cabin earlier. But then it seems like, according to Dale Cooper and Albert, that this killer had the killer's sights set on Laura, because maybe the killer didn't realize that Ronette regained consciousness and then was able to escape. Because after all, we saw her escape, and now she's in a coma at the hospital. Although we do get the ending of the episode, which I'll get to momentarily. But going back to this breakdown of what occurred, then we understand that the killing occurred. There was a mound of dirt with the locket, or the half-heart locket there, and the note, "Fire Walk With Me," and this idea of the blood. Remember, there was the bloody towel that was found outside that Hawk found, and the blood that was used to write "Fire Walk With Me" on the scrap of paper. We understand that this is not. They understand this is not. It's a rare blood type. I think they say AB negative. Although we understand from an earlier episode that I think Jacques Renault's blood type is AB negative. So I don't know if that's a. But anyway, the idea here is that it's probably the blood of the killer. And that's what they say in this discussion. And so the killer probably wrote this message in the killer's own blood. Fire Walk With Me. But whatever the case may be, so this is what they think happened. And so now the idea is, maybe the person who killed Laura Palmer is neither Jacques Renault nor Leo Johnson, but it could be another person. Who knows? We shall see. That's the situation. There's a shot of Andy crying, and he blows up at Albert, and everyone is kind of happy to see that. And so Albert doesn't have words to fight back with, so that's a kind of rare occasion, I think, on Albert's part. But in any event, this seems to be what's going on. It's a very grisly type of breakdown. It's still not leading to the answer of who killed Laura Palmer and who nearly killed Renette Pulaski, but we shall see. If we're talking about what might have happened, then we have to then go to the end of the episode, and let's end our discussion here with the end of the episode. But we go to in many cases might be said to be a kind of forgotten member. Not really, because Renette is still being mentioned, and Renette Pulaski and her connection with the perfume counter at Horne's department store, her the appearances in Flesh World and the like. But she's been in a coma, and so we get some shots of her. Remember, we got in the early episode, we got a little bit of her parents. Her father from the mill, and then her parents in the hospital talking with Hawk. But nothing more in terms of her family life, at least directly. Not to the extent that we get to know more about Laura Palmer, that's for sure. But she is still a victim, and she's still a very significant victim. And in many ways, she's also a potential witness as to what happened. So all eyes are still set on Renette Pulaski, but she's still in a coma, although she seems to be stirring. And what do we see when we see her stirring? We see images flash. And she says, Laura, Laura. She's visibly upset. What do we see? Flash. We see this person, this mysterious figure with gray, silver, long gray hair. It seems to be very frightening, growling, screaming, crying, in rage. And we see this really frightening, stabbing motion. We see a shot of this mysterious, scary figure in a place which appears to be the train car and Laura Palmer, and the darkness and the shadow and the flashing light, and we see and hear the screams. The implication is maybe that the killing of Laura Palmer is something that we're seeing being represented right here before our very eyes. This is very scary stuff. The way this episode ends is up to now the scariest ending of any episode of Twin Peaks so far. There is a moment in this, right, which is, you get a shot of Laura Palmer, and the way that and the idea is maybe this is her at the moment of being killed, which is so scary in and of itself. But the way that her face is lit and the blood, it's very unpleasant. But it's almost like she is both a victim and a demon at the same time. The way that her face is lit, it's like she's a devil or demon. It's very scary stuff, and it's quite grisly. And this is, I think, the first time we're getting a sense of the horror up close, directly, what happened. I mean, we got the aftermath. We got the investigation of the actual train car location, the crime scene. We getting these details spoken out by Cooper, by Albert, by others. But we don't actually see this, but we do see it today. We do see it here, and it is utterly, utterly frightening. And it's frightening because of this figure, this figure with silver hair that we have seen before, with the artist sketch by Andy from Sarah's description. Andy's a great artist, by the way. We get these visions here and there. The mentioning maybe of the connection Bob. What is this name, Bob, and who's this? We're not sure, but maybe we're seeing something that might have actually happened to Laura Palmer. Maybe this figure, who seems to have been called Bob, maybe this figure has something to do with this, more so than we might have first anticipated or expected. In any event, what a scary, scary way to end. And it's very frightening, and it's a really horrific reminder of the true horror that we're talking about, that's underlying this mystery. And we're talking about the killing of an innocent victim in this really scary, scary way. And then we have Renette, who seems to be stirring, about to awaken, maybe, to provide more answers to come. Will they come or won't they come? We'll have to wait until the next episode to find out. Of Twin Peaks. So, yes, lots to say here. Lots to say. A lot of great things to say about this episode. I mean, I'm continuing to be totally, totally impressed. Right? I mean, that goes without saying, I think, with this landmark series that is Twin Peaks. The music is outstanding. The pies, there's more emphasis now on pies again. I must say it again, chocolate peanut butter pie. If anyone has ever eaten that, please let me know what you think, because I'd love to know what that tastes like. Oh my goodness, chocolate peanut butter pie. I've never seen that in a store or anything like that. I can't make a pie to save my life, so, but if I could, I'd definitely try to attempt a chocolate peanut butter pie. Wow. Norma's chocolate peanut butter pie, the Double R Diner. Wow, that would be like Wow. Yes. That would be like my heaven. Incidentally, too, I love the bit where Pete's talking about, he's reminiscing, remembering Catherine and that really tumultuous relationship that he had with her. It was sometimes like hell, but other moments like heaven. He mentions the word heaven. I love that too. Jack Nance talking about heaven, right? I mean, I mentioned this reference before, but going back to the very start in terms of feature films and David Lynch, Eraserhead, in heaven, everything is fine. So I'd like to think that maybe in his heart, Pete is saying there when he's talking about Catherine, there are moments of heaven in my relationship with Catherine, and indeed in heaven, everything is fine. Wow, wow. You've got your good things and I've got mine. But anyway, yes, Eraserhead. That'll be a discussion for another day, my friends. But for now, yes, so much to say, so much to say, so little time, and we are not even done with the series because we still have a lot to go, a lot of places to go, a lot of wonderful, scary, beautiful places to go in the world of Twin Peaks. All right, my dear friends, so let's stop there and we'll continue on in the next video. But until then, my dear friends, please continue to be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies and films. Until then, my friends, thank you and cheers.